Our program today is called One Pill Can Kill, and it's being presented by Mr. Guy Gomez, Community Outreach Specialist with the Drug Enforcement Administration in St. Louis. Mr. Gomez's area of responsibility cover the entire states of Missouri and Kansas, as well as the southern portions of Illinois. His current assignment is focusing on this nation's opioid epidemic, and even more so the fentanyl crisis plaguing our communities. Before I get to the next paragraph, I don't know how true it is or not, but on National Geographic television, I watch To Catch a Smuggler. That's like my binge TV, and I will tell you it's unbelievable fentanyl coming into our country, so it's very scary. Drug abuse and addiction are no longer the primary pathway to drug poisonings and death. The old mentality that they must have been a druggie or an addict is no longer the case. One choice, one pill, one chance is all that you may have. So now please join me in giving a really warm welcome. He is from Southern California and has only lived in Missouri 7 months. So let's show him a Missouri welcome for Mr. Guy Gomez.
I want to introduce myself to you guys, just so you know a little bit about my history, where I come from and my career, so that way you can get an understanding of what I'm going to be sharing with you here today. So again, my name is Guy Gomez. I'm the Community Outreach Specialist for the DEA St. Louis Division. I was born and raised in Southern California, where I lived all my life in various parts. And I also served as a police officer for a couple of different municipalities out there. I was a field training officer. I investigated everything from a simple traffic collision to murder. And all in between there, I also conducted drug investigations, either manufacturing, distributing, trafficking, under the influence, possession for sales, and so on. And from there, I moved into working as in law enforcement at a local university out there. I worked there as a sergeant for almost about 10 years, and so whatever I saw in the municipalities, I also saw happening at the universities as well. And we're such a close-knit family of universities and colleges, I knew what was going on and trending, and the threats that were going on and surrounding universities, colleges, and the drugs that were emerging there too. Drugs have been going on forever, since almost the beginning of time, possibly. And now they're at their most deadliest with fentanyl, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. One pill can kill messaging, one pill can kill campaign. And having worked in law enforcement for many years, I've been in law enforcement, both public and private fields, for almost 30 years. And from working in law enforcement, I've experienced and seen what the traumas of law enforcement have on an individual. And I've seen individuals suffer with trauma, grief, PTSD, where it drives them to become homicidal and suicidal, where they've actually have had friends commit suicide. Think about committing murder because they don't know how to deal with the trauma and the grief that they're dealing with. And I've also seen some of my friends deal with the trauma and PTSD with substance use and abuse, and they've also been able to recover. However, they each had their traumatic roads to recovery as well. And so I decided to go back to school and get my master's degree in clinical psychology, and I became a mental health clinician on the side, so I can help first responders battling with trauma and PTSD. And that took me into another field where I was helping people with all different kinds of mental illness, mental health, personality disorders, psychosis, addiction, grief, and so on. I've done it at an individual level, a couples level, marital level, groups, families, different types of group therapy, marital, divorce, addiction. And from there, the DEA in Los Angeles found me and said, hey, your background is very rare. It almost doesn't exist between law enforcement and having the mental health background. And so they offered me a position to be the first community outreach specialist in the DEA in Los Angeles. And so I did that for about 3 years in Los Angeles Field Division, which had 7 counties around Los Angeles metropolitan area, the whole state of Nevada, the whole state of Hawaii, and the 2 countries of Guam and Saipan. So I've been around to see what works, what doesn't work, what needs improvement, and what needs improvement is messaging. So I thank all of you for showing up here today, because this is a large room with it looks like almost every seat filled here, and this is probably one of the largest groups that I've had in a long time outside of, like, let's say, the provider industry, like the mental illness and public health and mental health business. And from there, when COVID kicked in and it shut down the whole country, I left because there wasn't anything for me to do. And so I went to investigate Paycheck Protection Program fraud. Does anybody know what that is? From the U.S. CARES Act, where the funds were, U.S. dollars were given to small businesses so they could survive, or try to. I saw a lot of these funds being diverted away from American small business. Drug cartels were stealing it. People in prison were stealing it. People from outside of this country were stealing these funds. I watched them go into different countries through fraudulent applications. So my job was I was on a team of investigators where we investigated a lot of that. After a couple of years of doing that, I was recruited to come back, and I was in a small unit with the U.S. Postal Inspection Services, where it was my job to hunt down illicit drugs being mailed through the U.S. postal system. There are so many drugs that are being mailed through there that the postal inspectors themselves cannot investigate all of them. And so they created a unit where we would administratively seize these packages, and I would seize hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of drugs every week. And it was only a 3 to 4 person unit in Los Angeles, in the largest distribution processing center in the country. And that was just what we were able to catch. That's not what was being actually mailed through, or mailed. Missouri, I saw a lot of packages come into Missouri. Missouri is a hub for these illicit drugs to make their way from the southwest border through the rest of the United States. They'll land here and then get redistributed either up into the New England area or down into the Florida area. However, Missouri is a hub for a lot of these drugs, and what we're seeing is a lot of fentanyl and methamphetamine, and cocaine is back on the rise coming out here. With all of that said, I want to introduce you to the DEA a little bit in case you're unaware of what DEA does. So DEA has 2 main divisions in the field, which is the Enforcement Division and Diversion Control Division. So the Enforcement Division goes after the biggest and the baddest of the drug dealers, not only in the United States, but globally. We have offices, foreign offices all over the world, and we have 23 divisions within the United States. Hundreds of special agents that go after these drug dealers, smugglers, traffickers, and sellers. We also have Diversion Control Division. Does anybody in here in the medical field? A doctor, a nurse, pharmacist? Okay, we got 1, 2? Okay. So diversion control is the regulatory compliance unit or division that monitors everything that has to do with scheduled drugs from what we call the maker to the taker, from the manufacturer all the way till where it either gets dispensed to the person who it's prescribed to or administered to. So if you're a patient, you get a drug that's administered to you by your doctor, then it leaves the circle of diversion, and it's no longer part of our diversion control program. They do regulatory compliance on medical doctors, facilities that house it, distribution centers, pharmacists, pharmacy techs, for how many drugs are being manufactured, the quantity of drugs that are being manufactured, the distribution, the prescription, the usage, and has anybody ever heard of a PMP, prescription monitoring program? I'll talk about that in a little bit too, which could be, it's a very good tool for DEA to use because it allows us to see what the doctors are prescribing and to whom and how many pills are out there. And we've seen a doctor with prescribing, I think, 1 million pills of oxycodone, a painkiller, and the population of the city is only 500. And so DEA has been able to go after the very, very small percentage of these doctors, or the registrants as we call them. Less than 1% are looked at as being not illegitimate, but irresponsible in some ways, and either our diversion control investigators will conduct an administrative or criminal investigation that could lead to prison time. The third area that we have is the newest. It's not a division yet, it's a section, and that's community outreach. Our administrator, Ann Milgram, is dedicated to bringing these types of messages to the people in our country and our communities, because we need to address the demand for these types of drugs. If we can educate our public, and by educating you, and then you go home and share this message with your other family members and friends and loved ones and neighbors and coworkers, then they'll be educated enough to educate others and others and others down the road, exponentially. So if we can deliver that message, we can affect the demand for that, which means if we can lower the demand for drugs, theoretically, in business practice, we can therefore lower the supply for those drugs. So when El Chapo was arrested, does everybody know who El Chapo is? Okay. So when El Chapo was arrested, he was asked, what's it going to take for the drug cartels to stop smuggling drugs in the United States? And he said business 101. When there's no demand, there's no supply. And so if we can come together and reduce the demand for it, then theoretically we would reduce the supply for it as well. And so our administrator put one of our positions in each one of our divisions, a community outreach specialist, and made them from a contract position into a full-time DEA federal employee position to show how much she's dedicated to this mission. And so my area of responsibility is the entire state of Missouri, the entire state of Kansas, and the southern portion of Illinois. Now, it's only me. We have hundreds of special agents that go out and attack the supply end of it, but law enforcement knows that we can't arrest our way out of it. Federal agencies know it, local law enforcement agencies know it, and we don't want to arrest our way out of it. We want to reduce the demand to reduce the supply because we don't have enough jails to put people in. And with our jail system and judicial systems in different states coming up with different plans on how to address this, sometimes they're ineffective, or sometimes the community members don't like how the judicial system and law enforcement is addressing this problem. And so, again, if we can help educate people, in theory, we can help reduce the drug usage, overdose, and overdose death. And so I want to share with you for a little bit about what's happening. How are these drugs making their way here? Every drug is made up of compounds. They're called precursors. So these precursors for these illicit drugs, and I'm going to talk specifically about fentanyl right now, these precursors are manufactured in China, and they're also being dealt with in India. And there's trafficking going back and forth there too. But the primary area is these precursors are being made in China, and they're being shipped over into Mexico. They're being purchased and processed by the Mexican drug cartels. And these cartels are taking these precursors and they're combining them and making illicit fentanyl. Now, who knows what fentanyl is? Okay. For those of you who don't know, fentanyl is an opioid. It's a painkiller. It's a synthetic painkiller. It is not made from any type of plant or that grows from the earth. It is purely chemical compounds put together, chemically rearranged in order to make illicit fentanyl. This illicit fentanyl is then packaged up either in, it's called a kilo. Has anybody ever heard of a kilo? Okay. A kilo is 2.2 pounds, and it's usually in a brick about maybe 6 by 8 by like 1.5 inches thick. And they're packed really tight, and they're smuggled into the United States. Now, they were pressing them into pills and smuggling them into the United States as well. It still might be happening, but it's not as good. They don't make as much money because you take something round and put it next to something else that's round, and there's a gap. And so you can't fill it. You can't fill the gap with the product that they need to sell and distribute throughout the United States. Well, it goes even beyond that. If I'm smuggling pills, there's only about 2 milligrams of fentanyl in each pill, and that takes away from my profitability too. So now I'm smuggling a compound, a cutting agent, that I could buy in the United States easily and press it into a pill with the illicit fentanyl that I'm making. So the drug cartels are mainly sticking to packaging them up in the big quantities are packaged up in kilos. Those kilos are then smuggled into the United States through the southwest border, and then, like I shared before, they make their way into Missouri. It's a hub, one of the hubs out here, one of the main hubs for redistribution of the rest of the country into the New England area and down into Florida. If you can see on the top, there's a couple of arches that make their way up, but they don't come down. They actually come back down over, they make their way into Canada, and then Canada feeds into the New England area as well. Fentanyl, well, I want to show you this first. In 2023, over 110,000 people died of a drug overdose. Of that 110,000, 67% involved synthetic opioids, primarily, and an opioid is a painkiller, and of those synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl was the cause of overdose and overdose death. 110,000 people dying of a drug overdose is about 301 people every day dying of a drug overdose. That's like a full airliner, like a 737, probably even more, falling out of the sky every day. Now, if that were to happen, what would we do? We'd be outraged. All the planes would land. We wouldn't allow another plane to go up in the air until we figured out what the problem was and why it was crashing. But this is happening every day, and it's been happening for years. Years. And so last year, it was about 107,000 people that died of a drug overdose. Now it's increased to 110,000, but the synthetic drugs are on the rise, and the natural drugs are decreasing. What does that mean? Synthetic drugs mean that they're made in a lab, that there's nothing real about, they don't grow naturally from like a coca plant that makes cocaine, or like a poppy where we derive heroin from. The reason for that is because it takes a lot of land, and irrigation, and farmers to manufacture to plant the plants, process them. It takes a lot of land, water, time, the right weather. They don't want to be seen by aerial surveillance and satellites, and so these synthetics can be made in just a room, a bedroom. We can make illicit fentanyl and or methamphetamine within hours and sell it out on the street, where it would take months to cultivate marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. So let's look at this in another way. How many people have been to Busch Stadium for a Cardinals game? Okay. How many people have been to Enterprise for a Blues game? And City Park for a City game? Only one. Okay. Oh, two. I'll be three then. I'll have to go to a game this season. Well, imagine selling out Busch Stadium, selling out City Park Stadium, and filling Enterprise Center twice. And that's how many people die every year. And yet, we haven't done anything about it. What are we doing? Our law enforcement can't go after everybody everywhere all the time because there's just not enough of us. And so once again, I want to emphasize the point. Learn something here today and take it back to your communities, take it back to your homes, take it back to your families, because the information that you give to your friends and family, and if they remember something when they're talking to their friends and family, if we save one life, we just won, because life is priceless. And so in 2023, DEA seized 386 million doses. That's just lethal doses. That's just what DEA sees. That's not any other federal law enforcement agency. That's not any other local law enforcement agency. No, not the cities, the counties, the state police. No other law enforcement agency. Just DEA seized 386 million lethal doses. There's only 332 million people in the United States. Just DEA seized enough doses to kill every person in the United States, plus about another 54 million. That's a lot. A kilo is 2.2 pounds. 1 kilo has 1 million milligrams. 2 milligrams can kill one person. Therefore, 1 kilo of fentanyl can kill 500,000 people. And we're seizing kilo after kilo after kilo every year. And so I want to show you what a lethal dose is considered a lethal dose. That's about 2 milligrams that fits on the tip of a pencil. It's very light, it's very flaky. It can go airborne, and it can actually stay airborne for a certain period of time depending upon how fine the powder is produced. The lethal dose can go up or down based upon your genetics, your tolerance levels, and how pure that fentanyl is. And so again, this is just an average lethal dose, 2 milligrams. It can go up or down for every different individual. So what does it look like in a pill? Can everybody see this yellow magnifying glass up here? Okay, if you were to look at that, just make it into a sphere, that's about 2 milligrams. And they press it into a pill. So what's in the rest of the pill? It's a cutting agent, a bulking agent. It could be anything that they want in it. And so this is why they don't like smuggling in pills, because now they're smuggling in all of that when they can buy it here for free. Or not buy it for free. They can buy it here without having to smuggle it here. And so they make their money, again, smuggling in the kilos. And actually I want to talk about something a little bit later. It's called the chocolate chip cookie effect, and why it's dangerous when these cartels are pressing pills laced with fentanyl. So I want you to look at this. This is what the St. Louis Division seized over the last several years, going back to 2019. If you look at the bottom, it says 15% purity. That means everything that the DEA St. Louis Division seized in 2019 at a purity level of 15%, which is very low. That means that, let's just talk about 1 kilo of fentanyl getting transported from its source in Mexico, where it's smuggled across into the United States by the cartels. And then what happens is every time it changes hands, it most likely gets stepped on. It's a term that's stepped on means I take, if I'm buying the drugs directly from the cartel, I'll take 1 kilo, I'll break it in half, I'll make it 1.1 pounds, but then I'll get a cutting agent, and I'll make the 1.1 into 2.2, and I'll make the other 1.1 into 2.2, and I just doubled my profits. Well, that happens all the time. Every time it changes hands, it gets stepped on, which means the purity levels go down. Well, look in 2019, 15% purity levels. If we jump to the yellow bar in 2022, it was 38% purity. And then in 1 year, it almost doubled. In 2023, what we seized was 76% pure, which means there's a lot more fentanyl out there, which means that the drug market out there is saturated with fentanyl, which means that makes our lives more at risk. And you don't have to be a druggie or an addict anymore. Addiction and using and abusing drugs is no longer in the pathway from recreational use or a one-time use, leading towards overdose and overdose death. 1 pill can kill. And so what the DEA seized last year, this was just updated a few weeks ago. Last year it was 6 out of 10 pills, now it's 7 out of 10 pills. Now headquarters wanted to use a graphic, so because we're dealing with fentanyl-laced pills, they wanted to use a graphic to represent 70%, so they put it into pill form. But the reality of it is 70% of what we seized had fentanyl, or a lethal dose of fentanyl in it. And so I want to draw attention to that, because when we talk to our children, or kids, or teenagers about this, I don't want them to think that 3 pills are safe. 70%, 70%. And when we say it 7 out of 10, that inference is, or sends a message that, hey, there's still some safe ones out there. And we have to consider that everything is dangerous and lethal. And so I'm going to go through these slides really quick, because I want to show you what the most common fake pills are. OxyContin, Adderall, and Xanax. So OxyContin is an opioid, it's a painkiller. It's also known as Oxy or M30s. That's a typical M30, 30 milligram. It's the dosage for that type of pill. It's the most common pill that's manufactured that's fake with Oxy. Adderall is used for, it's a stimulant, it's used for people suffering with ADD, attention deficit disorder, and Xanax is a benzodiazepine, and it's used for people suffering with anxiety. Now, I'm going to talk about 2 different avenues of these pills. One is the licit side, meaning legal, and the illicit side, meaning the illegal, the manufactured pills. So I want to talk about the genuine pills that are made in a genuine lab, prescribed by a doctor for the right purpose to the right person, and they're being used legitimately. They're being used by what the prescription says. OxyContin, painkiller. Has anybody ever played football in here? Or had a relative play football? Or seen a football game? Any kind of active sport where you might get injured? Okay. So, a legitimate doctor, let's just call it a 15-year-old football player blows his knee out playing a football game. Extremely painful to tear a ligament. And the doctor prescribes them OxyContin, Oxy, painkiller, opioid. But then, because they are now dealing with the pressures of not being able to get the scholarships or being drafted into the NFL, or if they're a high competitive player where there's high stakes that are involved, now they're injured and they can't do those anymore. Well, what if they also have parents that put pressure on them to be perfect? Pressure, you need to go out there, suck it up, rub some dirt on it kind of mentality. And our children, all of us, maybe even in here, have suffered with that. Whether or not how we dealt with it might be different nowadays than it was, or then when we grew up with it versus nowadays. Well, then they go and seek mental health services. And it's like they see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist says, well, you're suffering with anxiety from all the stress and pressure, and I'm going to prescribe you a benzodiazepine. And this is where the PMP comes into play. It's a prescription monitoring program. They were voluntary in the state of Missouri until I think late last year when the state said we are going to make it mandatory to have a prescription monitoring program. And what that does is it allows doctors to see what other doctors are prescribing them. And that way, let's say, pre-PM or mandatory PMP, if a doctor had could voluntarily input their prescriptions to a certain person into a system, the PMP database, and they choose not to for whatever reason, and it happens, then two doctors prescribing one person legitimate medication for legitimate injuries and mental health issues are giving them a cocktail that will lead them, an opioid combined with a benzodiazepine will lead, or it was, last time I checked it was about an 86% likelihood that you will overdose death. So that's why PMPs are important, because the doctors need to know what's being prescribed by them. Because if the football player doesn't tell the psychiatrist that he's getting an opioid and vice versa, then those doctors could be giving a cocktail for death. Adderall, I want you all to know too, because now we're in a college setting in university. I worked at a university for almost 10 years and I saw a lot of drugs going in and out of college and university, especially when the university was like, no, they're not, because whatever reason. But Adderall, it's used for attention deficit disorder. It's a stimulant. And what I saw at the university that I worked at, and it happens a lot across the country, they'll crush it up and snort it. And what the student will do is they've been told that this drug will allow them to retain information, and so they'll do it during midterms and finals, because they think it'll help them retain the information that they're cramming for to take those exams. Well, it doesn't. It's a stimulant. It allows them to stay awake longer and study longer, but it doesn't allow them to retain information, but they still believe it. Well, these drug cartels, when they would, heroin came in a powder form, and it was cooked, and then it was put into a syringe and injected. Well, for many, many years, many decades, heroin was viewed as being a dirty drug. It's dirty because it's for poor people, the poor addict, the homeless, the druggies, the addicts, and so on. Well, when the pharmaceutical companies started overprescribing these drugs, and that's what started this epidemic, the drug cartels caught on. They were like, hey, the pills that are now more regulated by DEA and other law enforcement agencies, they said, let's just make our drug look like their drug. Now it's medication. Now it's okay. Now it's acceptable. So I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about the perceptions of what's acceptable and what's dirty and what's not. If we're to go home and sit down and drink a 12-pack of beer in my recliner every night, I could be labeled an alcoholic. But if I come home and drink a bottle of wine with my pinky up, I'm relaxing. Right? I can have a glass of wine in a bathtub and a candle and I'm okay. Put me in the pool with a beer and I'm an alcoholic. Well, it's the same with heroin and pills. Heroin's dirty. Pills are acceptable by many of us because of what they look like. Well, nowadays these pills, what we're saying is one pill can kill. Every one of these pills, if it's not prescribed to you by a doctor for legitimate purposes and taken under what the doctor's care or what the doctor wants for you, or how to take them, then consider it a pill that can kill, because you don't know where they came from. I'll share with you a story. I talked to a mother. She lost her son, a 25-year-old son, about 2 years ago. She said that he was at his girlfriend's house and he had a headache, and he asked her for some medication, and she came back with a pill. He took it and died of a fentanyl poisoning. He wasn't an addict. He wasn't a druggie. He didn't go out looking for it. He didn't even buy it. He got it with what I call a hug and a handshake. His girlfriend said, "Here, take this." He didn't know what it was. Took it because he trusted her, because they had a relationship. He took it and died and lost his life. This happens a lot. So all of the people that we're looking at, 110,000 people dying, 67% are opioid, a lot of them don't even know what's in the pill. And a lot of them are between the ages of, I think it's 25 and 45 years old, and they don't know what they're taking. Or they know what they're taking and just taking a chance, because sometimes the withdrawals of these drugs feel worse than you can imagine. And so they go out there and try to find these drugs to take that pain away from the withdrawal. And they don't think correctly, they don't think right. So their choice of making a good decision for themselves diminishes a lot. So I'm going to put you through a midterm right now. One's real, one's fake. So who thinks, raise your hand if you think the top one is real. Who thinks the top one is fake? And who doesn't think anything?
Wake up.
All right. So top one's real, bottom one's fake. How many people got it wrong? One pill can kill. See how that works? Now, I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of pills. I got this wrong. And when I was first investigating drugs and pills like this back in the mid to late 90s, they taught us and trained us, look for pills that are falling apart, because the drug cartels are not putting in a binder that holds the pill together, and they'll fall apart. And so I looked at it and I'm like, well, look at the top. The impression is weak, the pill's falling apart, but then I look down here and the impressions are deep, it's not falling apart, and I went, that's the real one. One pill. So now here's your final exam. This is a Xanax, a benzodiazepine. Who thinks the top one is real? Who thinks the top one is fake? And who's asleep?
I took the paper clip.
Right? Top one's real, bottom one's fake. Who got it wrong? One pill can kill. I got it wrong too, for the same reasons as the other pill. And now I want to show you where fentanyl is made for legitimate purposes. This is a medical grade fentanyl lab. And you can see how complex, sterile, and clean this place is. It takes a lot of science and scientific engineers to make these labs and to run them. And this is where the cartels are making them. Because they don't care. I've seen photographs of, you know, the 5-gallon buckets that you can get from Lowe's and Home Depot. I've seen, they'll hire like people in villages and whatnot to do all their dirty work so they don't get affected by it. But I've seen like a villager, what I call a villager, grab a 5-gallon bucket, put fentanyl in it, a certain amount, put the cutting agent into it, filling the bucket to the top, and all they're protected with is a PPE mask, what we all had to wear for COVID, and a broomstick. And they're stirring it up. And the only thing saving them, what they think is saving them, is this mask, and they're standing upwind. And the wind, whatever comes out of this bucket is just going downwind, and what if there's somebody else down there? I mean, they're going to get affected too, but this is how they make it. And when they stir it in a system like that, and as you can see, it doesn't look very scientific here, because they're not chemists and they're not drug manufacturers, they cannot evenly distribute that fentanyl to every part of that bucket. And then when they go to press the pills, package the kilo, and then press the pills later, fentanyl is not evenly distributed in each one of the pills. Which brings me to what's called the chocolate chip cookie effect. Who's ever eaten a chocolate chip cookie? Me too. I like homemade ones, but if I go to the store and buy one, it's Costco because they got big chunks of chocolate in it. I can't drink milk, but I love the milk chocolate chip cookies. And so, and everybody knows in a chocolate chip cookie, there is not a chocolate chip in every part of the cookie. There may be a chocolate chip in every bite, but there's not a chocolate chip in every piece of the cookie. And so how does that translate over into the pills? Well, we can see the pills on the right. When pills are manufactured, if they are allowed to be taken in half doses, you'll see that line in a pill where you can break it in half and take a pill, right? Or if I only need half. Well, we can do that. And sometimes when our kids are going to parties, they'll buy a handful of pills. Well, if they buy 5 pills and they got 10 friends, they'll have them. And sometimes somebody will overdose and somebody will die, and both of them might get high, and something might not happen at all. Well, now I want to show you the next photo with the piece of fentanyl cut out looking like a piece of pie. That piece of pie does not have any fentanyl in it. There's no chocolate chips in it. And so when we use test strips, has anybody ever heard of a fentanyl test strip? It's a strip, it's a harm reduction tool to test illicit drugs. And so there are groups out there that believe we can use these test strips to test these fake pills looking for fake drugs. Now, about 25 years ago, I had a sergeant. I was a relatively new police officer. I had a sergeant, and we were talking about some call for service, and I said, well, let's just create a new broader scenario within this call for service. And what would I do here? And should I have done something here, or shouldn't I have done something there? Do something or not do something? And he said, it's always better to explain why you did something than why you didn't do something. And that stuck with me for the last 25 years. And so I would rather try, if I'm suffering with addiction and I want to not die, I want to stay alive, use a test strip. But there's 3 things that the test strip doesn't do. 1, it doesn't test the potency level of that fentanyl. It only tests for fentanyl and no other drug, and it doesn't test the whole pill, because they'll scrape portions off of it, put it into a water solution, dip this test strip in it to see if there's anything in it. Well, if they only broke off a piece with no fentanyl in it, they're going to get a negative result. And the other thing is, if they're putting in other drugs such as cocaine, carfentanil, xylazine, nitazine, and I'll talk about a few of those drugs later, or a benzodiazepine, that's not in there as well. So we have to be cautious when we promote certain resources like a test strip, but I do believe something's better than nothing. And anybody heard of Snapchat? Okay, how many people in here have Snapchat? I'm gonna put my hand down because I don't have any social media. I did away with it because I just I believe that it helps promote something that I'm trying to unpromote through my job, which is the addiction to drugs. And dopamine is made in our own head. Has anybody ever heard of dope? That's where it comes from. Dopamine is made in our own brains, and it's the feel-good drug. And I'll explain to you that in a moment, in the next couple of slides. But Snapchat has a function in there where you can see other Snapchatters in your area. There's a little map that you can see. And what the drug dealers will do is they'll see somebody with a high, I think it's called some kind of count. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Sure.
Okay. There's like each individual gets some kind of rating. And the higher rating means the more popular you are, from what my understanding is. And what these drug dealers will do, they'll find somebody with a high rating, because if they can tap into a high rater, then that means they can sell for them or buy from them and sell to their friends. So it's a prime target for them. These are some of the emojis that they use to communicate with each other about the different types of drugs that they have or that the person is trying to buy. There's a story that I like to share with you about a gentleman that I met a few months ago, and I travel around with him and do presentations. And he had a 16, 17-year-old son, really, really smart. He played multiple sports and taught himself how to play piano. And I saw a video of him playing classical piano, and it was just a beautiful thing. And the story goes, his son, I think, was out with some friends, came across a Snapchatter that hit him up for some drugs. And so they meet up. And I think his son asked about one kind of drug, and the drug dealer offered him what was being called a Percocet. A Percocet is another painkiller. And he said, you guys look like the drug dealer told him and his friend, you guys look like you work out. And are you athletes? He said, yeah. He goes, well, I have a Percocet here. And if you take this Percocet, you won't feel the pain of your workout, which means you can work out longer and get stronger and bigger quicker. So he bought it, went back home. This was Christmas night a few years ago. Took the pill, and Dad walked in the next morning, the day after Christmas, found his son what appeared to be asleep on his desk, hand on the mouse, just kind of slumped over. And he said he just knew something was wrong, and when he went to wake him, he knew he was gone. And so he said he laid him down on the ground and started CPR right away, and his other son walked in and he told him to go call 911. Well, his son was already gone. And so he lost a son that day, one pill, one time, wasn't an addict, wasn't a druggie, just one choice and one bad mistake, and the pill took his life. And now the dad, he goes around and does presentations like this in his own way with his story. But once again, addiction and drug use and an overdose death, addiction's no longer in the way. It's no longer in the pathway from recreational or one-time use to overdose and overdose death. It's not. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the neuroscience of this too, and what makes it hard for people who are addicted to drugs to just say no. Does everybody remember in the 80s, Nancy and Ronald Reagan, Just Say No? Okay. I grew up as a kid in the 80s, and I remember my DARE officer coming over and doing a presentation of Just Say No for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we got to play with him at recess. And then my dad was like, don't do drugs, because I'm not picking you up from jail. And my dad had this mentality, everything always led to digging ditches at the cemetery making 15 cents or 50 cents an hour. Dad, can I go to the movies with my friends? He's like, what are you going to do? You're going to smoke weed, and you're going to drink alcohol, and then you're going to get arrested, and you're going to have a record, and you can't get a job, and then you're going to be digging ditches at the cemetery making 50 cents. Me and my two brothers, we will tell you that my dad is known for that. Anything. Like, Dad, can I just wait to mow the lawn tomorrow? Why? You like digging ditches? And so my dad was funny, he had great intentions, but he scared me straight. DARE scared me straight. And there's a lot of people out there that will say scared tactics don't work. And I argue that. They work for me, they work for others. They may not be the primary way for it to work, because mental health field for many years knows that Just Say No really doesn't work as effective as most people might think it does, because if we could just say no to drugs, we should just say no to murder, sexual assault, arson, and any other kind of crime out there. We should be crime-free if we could just say no. And so for some people, we can just say no. And for some people suffering with addiction, they can't, and I'll go into a little bit of that in a moment. This is what I call the marriage. One person does all the talking, one person does all the listening. This is the transmitter, this is the receptor, all right? You figure out who you are in that relationship. All right. And so this is what's called the synapses connection. These are neural synapses in our brain. The one on the left, that's the transmitter. The gap in between is called the synapses gap, and the portion on the right is called the synapses receptor. So transmitter, receptor, talker, listener. And what happens when we use a drug, it'll make its way down the synapses, it'll make its way into a little pocket, it gets released from the transmitter into the synapses gap, and it'll fall across the synapses gap and land into a receptor on the receptor side. Now what happens there is, let's say it's fentanyl. Fentanyl will fall into the opioid receptors and it will block the signals. The signals that regulate your respiratory system. And so you'll fall into respiratory depression, meaning that you usually have about 9 to 12 respirations a minute. It'll gradually fall and decrease depending upon how much you use and how quickly you use and your tolerance levels and your genetics. And once you hit 0 respirations, you'll fall into cardiac arrest and die. That's how the overdose works. Now, there is Narcan. Everybody heard of Narcan or naloxone? They say it's a life-saving drug. It's a life-extending drug, is like to be a little bit more precise, because it doesn't save your life, it just allows you to extend it to a point where you can get medical and emergency services in an emergency room or by a medical doctor for treatment. And the way the naloxone works is it will be released by that synapses gap, or a synapses transmitter into the gap, and it'll knock out the fentanyl from the opioid receptors on the receiving side. It'll knock them out and allow the signals to start going through again. So that means your respirations will start to increase, your heart rate will stay normal, and you could still be under the influence of the drug, because now it's hovering, all the fentanyl is hovering in the synapses gap. But you will be alive and awake and talking and communicating like we are right now. And so when the naloxone wears off, if there is still a large amount or an effective amount of fentanyl in the synapses gap, it will fall back into the receptors, you'll relapse, which could also lead you into another overdose and overdose death. Which is why if you know anybody that's suffering from a possible fentanyl overdose or drug poisoning, it's okay to give them the naloxone. The trainings that I've heard say that it will have a negative impact on you if you don't have any opioid on board. You can administer it, and it's a precautionary administration just in case that they have taken some type of opioid. And so here's another graphic that I want to show you on how cocaine and dopamine work on the brain. So this is, again, the top one, the cone shape. That's the synapses transmitter. There's the synapses gap, and there's the synapses receptor. The orange balls here are dopamine, and the white ones with the wings is cocaine. And so here's how it works. When somebody takes and uses cocaine, it's released by the synapses transmitter. It hovers in the gap. It falls into the receptors. It also blocks what's called the reuptake gap, or synapses channel. You see up there in the green circle where there's a white cocaine molecule that has blocked the gate there. Well, what happens is when our brain, when we ingest the cocaine and we start to feel good, our brain releases this dopamine. That's the feel-good drug. It'll hover in this gap, and it'll start to drop into the dopamine receptors in the receptor side of the synapses. But then the cocaine blocks the synapses reuptake channel, keeping the fentanyl from being reabsorbed into the synapses gap, and it'll hover and continue to hover into that synapses gap until it gets metabolized. Well, the only place for it to go is into these channels, into these dopamine receptors. Well, when a lot of dopamine gets pushed into these receptors, that's where you feel the high. And so we start to get more tolerant of our own dopamine, and so we'll make more and more, because each time we use cocaine and we go through this process, I need more dopamine to feel more high. And so that means I need more cocaine. More cocaine, more dopamine, more high. Well, pretty soon, our brain can't keep up, and it'll stop producing dopamine. And when we don't have a feel-good drug, when goodness is gone, what's left? Darkness. So that's where they start to feel the withdrawals. And the withdrawals are physically painful as well, because what's happening is when there's no more numbing effect that's going on, those things start to fire off again. Anybody ever sat on their hand? When it wakes up, you feel the needles? Well, imagine that probably an infinite amount of times when they're dealing with a drug withdrawal. And so your brain will stop making dopamine, it'll shut down dopamine receptors, and you'll feel really, really bad. And when that happens, we no longer have the capability sometimes of making decisions for ourselves, let alone making good decisions for ourselves, because if we use the drug long enough, our brain can sometimes turn into a honeycomb inside, where portions of our brain will actually be chemically re-engineered and or die, which means that we can't think for ourselves. And so when we look at people that are suffering with this addiction, they may have started off with a choice, but it doesn't end with the choice as easily. And so we have to get them to treatment. But then how do we treat people who don't want treatment or fight treatment? And so that's a battle that we've been fighting for a very, very long time. And if anybody has the solution to that, you're probably going to be a gazillionaire. There's a couple of emerging threats that I want to talk to you about as I close up. Xylazine, has anybody heard of xylazine? It's an animal sedative. It's also known as tranq. It's not for human consumption. It's not scheduled by the FDA. It's not regulated by the DEA. And people are using and abusing it along with opioids. And so what it does is it's a sedative. It increases the high and prolongs the high when it's mixed with an opioid. That's why people are using it, and it's highly, highly, highly addictive. The DEA is trying to get it scheduled, but there's people that don't want it scheduled for some reason. I don't know why, but we need to be able to control that. And what it does is it makes people, like Google xylazine in Philadelphia, that's America's ground zero for it, and you'll see people standing around just like that all day long. Since it's not an opioid, Narcan will not work on it, and it also causes necrosis of your flesh, so it dies and there's no treatment for it. And so I just met with somebody on Monday who had a family or friend member who was dealing with this and necrosis, and they were actually cutting off their own skin, all the dead skin, because it was so painful. Now imagine how painful that is, and then you're just going to put yourself through cutting your own skin off, because that's less painful. That's what these drugs will do. This is one called nitazene. Nitazene was manufactured in the 1950s. It's an opioid. It's so potent and so strong that it could not be used in a usable amount. So the doctors that created it said we can't use it. The FDA scheduled it, parked it, put it on a shelf, not to be used for human consumption ever again. And the drug cartels got the recipe and started manufacturing this. Now it's 10 times more potent than fentanyl. And so the drug dealers are like, well, I can make less nitazene and make the same amount of profit, but why stop there? I'll just make more nitazene and more fentanyl and make more profit. And so we've actually found this in Montana and Wyoming. And so as I close up, DEA, we launched One Pill Can Kill, again, because we want to let the public know that addiction and drug abuse is no longer in the pathway to overdose and overdose death. We need your help. We need you to take this information back to your friends and family and neighborhoods and host an event, or partner up with nonprofits in your area that are organizations that will help get this word out. If you need me to come back out and do this presentation to another group of people, I'm available. There's 3 points that I want you to take away with today. Never take medicine that wasn't prescribed to you by your own doctor. Talk to your family and friends about the danger of buying drugs online, because consider everything that you buy online laced with fentanyl or some other kind of lethal drug, and spread the word that one pill can kill. One pill is all that it might take. One chance is all you might have, and one life is all we get. So it's an honor being here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. Thank you, Mr. Gomez. So just for the next few minutes, are there any questions? Does anybody have a question that ask our host? Yes, sir.
I'd like to know, now this fentanyl, is it used in legal, in our system, in legal drugs, instead of opium, or do we use it
Yes.
In our own medical drugs?
Yeah, so the question is fentanyl legal? And are there legal purposes for fentanyl? And the answer is yes. So when fentanyl was produced, manufactured, it was to be used for people suffering with cancer, and it was to make them comfortable during end-of-life treatment. And so there was only 3 ways that it was administered: in a liquid, that was injected through an IV by a doctor or medical professional, sublingual tablets, which would go under the tongue, and transdermal patches. It wasn't in a pill form ever, and it still isn't.
Great question. Yes, ma'am.
I just have hip replacement, and so I was asking them what medicine they put me on, and they said first it was the fentanyl, and because it lowered my blood pressure so low, they had to take me off it
Yeah.
and put me on the Oxycontin.
Mhm.
So why even do a fentanyl if it's, so bad?
So the comment was, I can share this with
Yeah.
the public. Okay. The comment was, she experienced a hip surgery. They gave her fentanyl, her blood pressure went down, and they took her off the fentanyl and gave her oxy. I'm not a medical professional, so I can't address the why to that. However, I will share with you a personal story of mine, which we need to look out for when this type of thing happens. So about 1.5 years ago, my daughter was involved in a serious car accident. She was in a car accident, somebody helped her out of the car and walked up into an embankment in this place of safety, and an unlicensed driver came down, didn't see the big rig, stopped in the middle of the freeway, swerved, went up the embankment, and hit the man who got my daughter out of the car and my daughter. The man pushed my daughter out of the way enough to save her life, but he was killed in the process. My daughter got flung all over the place. It shattered her left femur and almost came out of her thigh. It broke her left knee, tore the ligaments in her right knee, and broke her hip. She gets rushed to the emergency room. They load her up with fentanyl. I think the doctors are now using fentanyl, and this is just my personal observation and opinion, more loosely because they are pharmaceutical companies and drug companies push it. They push it. I mean, fentanyl's been around since the 50s, so why not use it in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s for car accidents as well? One thing even further than that is be careful and watch what they're putting into you in the hospitals. Same accident, my daughter is loaded up on fentanyl, a combination between fentanyl and the oxys. They're going back and forth. And nobody was there with her, but she was in one of these states where she was semi-conscious, and the nurse came in with the cart. You know, they're supposed to scan your wristband. So they scanned my daughter's wristband, alert. This is not the patient. Tried it again, and the nurse is just scanning it because she's waiting to give my daughter this medication. And my daughter said, "Stop, that's not me." She was able to read the cart, "That's not me," and see the name. "That's not me, that's not me. Do not give that to me." And the nurse just kept, why isn't this working? She was trying to override the alert that was put there to let her know she was in care. So they go and get help. Another nurse comes in and they say, "Well, this isn't the right patient." If they would have given my daughter that dose of fentanyl, my daughter would be dead. And so we have to not only watch out for ourselves in the street, but we have to watch out for what's going on in the medical facilities too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they had, they couldn't figure out why I was having low-grade fever and rate pulse.
Yeah.
And they even did an EKG on me, and it was just kind of like, well, we don't know.
Yeah.
And I go, what?
There was a woman in green. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, what names is fentanyl manufactured under?
The manufacturer names, I'm not sure. I haven't done that research. Yeah.
All right, one more question. Yes, sir.
You were talking about Narcan, and you almost said what I wanted you to say, which is when they use the Narcan, they need to take the person and get them into treatment of some sort. But what I see happening nowadays is they're using the Narcan on people, and then people are coming back and driving off.
Yes.
And I'm an old 12-stepper, so to me, it's like you don't change if you don't have to change.
Right.
To me, that's a sign you don't have to change. If you give them Narcan and they're allowed to continue to go on, that's why they continue taking opioids.
Right.
Why at some point don't we have some kind of a law or a rule that says, if I have to use Narcan, then you need to go in the hospital for a couple of days to get yourself treated?
So Narcan used to be a prescribed drug. You could only get it if somebody prescribed it. But then there was so much death and overdose and fentanyl poisonings that a lot of states are now saying you don't need a prescription, and it was also against the law to possess it without a prescription. So there's a lot of states that are now saying you don't need a prescription and it's lawful because we want to be able to help people and keep them from dying. Everybody has a different rock bottom. And so that's why everybody has a different point in their life to go and seek treatment for addiction. And in most cases, 80% of those people suffering with drug addiction suffer also with an underlying traumatic issue. And so we go and send them to treatment for the addiction, but we don't ever touch the comorbidity dual diagnosis of the underlying trauma that's there. And so we can do both. But then here's also something too. When we get into the drug courts do diversion, which means drug diversion, which means instead of going to jail, we're going to send you to drug treatment. But treatment only works if you want it to work. And so the people that are going through drug court treatment are checking a box to stay out of jail. Again, just going back to your point of I'm not done until I'm done. And so when I think you're done may be different than when an addict, somebody who's been suffering with addiction for a long time is done. And if we beat them over the head with, have you had enough yet? They typically withdraw, go somewhere else and find people that are more like-minded. So,
Well, thank you again for today, and thank you for the wonderful topic. Really appreciate that.